I am your host, Jason Hopcus, and honored to have Lindsey Chadwick with us today. Lindsey is a licensed professional counselor and a marriage and family therapy candidate. She has worked for the Hazelden Betty Ford Children's Program in Aurora, Colorado since 2008. She began working at Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation after completing her undergraduate degree in sociology at Colorado State University. She completed her master's degree in couples and family therapy at the University of Colorado, Denver in 2013. Lindsey has over 16 years of experience working with children, adolescents, adults, and families in groups and individual settings. She specializes in kids and teens impacted by addiction, animal assisted therapy, and healthy co parenting. Lindsey, welcome to Nobody's Perfect. It is a pleasure to have you here today, and I am so thrilled to have this conversation that absolutely cannot be talked about enough. So, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to share, but a little bit about what we do and how to help children and families, and start helping families heal in a different way.
Well, I love it as a starting point, and it looks like you've got quite a bit of experience under your belt and are continuing your education here as you move through this. Tell us a little bit more about how you got involved in this work and sort of what inspired you to work with youth and families in this arena.
Absolutely. I when I was younger, I knew I wanted to help people.
Okay.
I knew I wanted to go into like a human services type of uh, field, but didn't really know exactly how I wanted to do that.
Okay.
And so when I graduated from CSU, I was looking for a job in Denver, and I found a um, a posting about a admin assistant for the children's program. And back then it was before we had merged with Hazelden, so it was just the Betty Ford Center, and I knew that name, I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't really know exactly what the children's program did. So
Okay.
I started my interviews there, and part of my interview process is you volunteer and you kind of sit through a group. And our group is a 4-day group. It's a Thursday through Sunday. And it's for kids 7 to 12 who are impacted by substance use. Often it's a mom or dad or a sibling. So I went to this group, and Jerry Moe, who is the founder of the children's program and wrote all the curriculum, was facilitating. And there was this little girl who was probably about 7 years old. Her mom was pretty fresh in recovery, and this little girl was scared to death. She didn't know how to talk to her mom. She'd experienced a lot of things. She didn't know how to express and feel, and she we do an activity where kids get to share some of their story with their loved one. And she was so scared she ran under the table, and I watched Jerry get down and sit under the table with her, and he called her mom under the table, and they sat and they did their share and kind of talked about things. And afterwards, this family cried together and they hugged. And that little girl was such a different person after that. She was a kid again. She was running around having fun. And I saw that and was like, I have to be a counselor. I don't want to be an admin assistant behind the desk. I want to
Right.
be a counselor. This is awesome. This is amazing. That's life changing. And that a big part of that is because I experienced those things as a kid.
Okay.
My addiction runs through both sides of my family, and a long history of mostly alcoholism, some drug and other substance use disorders. But my dad struggled when he was younger with substance use disorder, and my brother also struggled. My brother has been sober for over 5 years, which is amazing, but I very much so lived through his journey as I was working here. So
Right.
I saw this program and this work as something I would have really benefited from as a kid, and my brother too, and just really wanted to be a part of that family healing in a way that I didn't have when I was younger. And so luckily I told them in my interview, like, well, I actually want to do that. I don't want to do this, but they weren't hiring for a counselor. I didn't have
Right.
the qualifications. So I worked here as the admin assistant, and that's when it's funny because I thought I wanted to be a lawyer for a while and go into like the legal side of things to help people in need, but I realized I much more enjoy the actual helping piece with the mental health. So I went back to school and got my degree in couple and family therapy at CU Denver, and worked here the whole time, and became a counselor, and then now I manage the program here in Colorado. So it's been a long journey, but I absolutely just fell in love with the idea of helping kids deal with these types of things, because Jerry Moe always said that, kids are the first ones hurt in a family when substance use disorder is around. They're also the last ones to get help. Um,
What I love in your story is that this is all sparked from that deeply personal story of your own family history, but it was really that it sounds like it was ignited from that personal connective experience that you saw with that little girl. And really what I took away from that is she was seen in that moment. Like somebody saw her for the struggles that she was facing and the things that she had been challenged with, and really, the powers that prevailed in the room showed up to meet her where she was. And based on what you just said, it sounds like that was a pretty profound experience that put you on this path. One of the things that I'm really curious about, and I know you do a lot of work in this and having your own story, I too have a family history of substance abuse and addiction, um, is really the generational piece that we see these patterns kind of repeated over and over throughout multiple generations in a family structure. Tell me a little bit more about, from your professional lens, like what do you see, and are the rates of addiction or substance use higher when there is a previous generation that has struggled with that?
Absolutely. There was a study, the Bridget Grant study showed that 75% of adults who are in treatment for substance use disorder grew up in a family where addiction was a problem.
Okay.
So we know statistically that's greatly increases a person's chance of also falling into addiction. We also know that 1 in 4 kids are living in a household with substance use disorder.
Wow.
And that's a huge number if you think about it.
Yes.
And the way I, see this disease being passed down is because of that shame and stigma of it's something to hide, it's something we don't talk about, it's something that we're ashamed of, and so we don't talk about it, and that's what keeps people sick. That's what keeps this disease from getting passed down to generation. Obviously, there's a genetic piece, of course, we understand that, but there's also this idea that kids are growing up in a home when addiction is around. Claudia Black actually is a researcher that I adore, and she coined the 3 rules of dysfunction in families: don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. So when kids are growing up in a family where they are seeing all of these things happen, or maybe just feeling them or experiencing, the aftermath, kids often don't see the use in their home because people don't use in front of them. However, they see the fighting, they see the tension, they experience the loss, they experience unsafe situations, and just this person who's not present, even if they're there.
Right.
And as they see all that and no one's talking to them about it, they very much so learn that it's not okay to talk about. And they often don't have language to talk about it either. I hear from people all the time, well, my kid didn't know anything, they never saw it, but it's like they also don't
Right.
know how to talk about it or when. So that is a big part of when you can't talk about it, you don't trust yourself, you don't trust your grown up, and people have all these feelings, these things that happen, and if we can't share any of that, how do we numb those feelings, right?
Right.
Well, the model that we were shown was alcohol and drugs. So a lot of kids, as we get older, will turn to alcohol and drugs too, even though they saw maybe how it hurt their family. It just is the only thing they know.
Well, it's a
Um,
natural course.
yes, absolutely. So it's it is a generational disease. It's a family disease. Everyone's impacted. We also call it a feelings disease, that people are struggling with heavy feelings and problems and secrets. And sometimes that relief, even if for a few minutes from the drugs and alcohol, can feel so much better because we um, don't know where to go with all of that stuff if it wasn't okay to talk about in our families.
Right. Well, you gave us that powerful and compelling statistic a minute ago, the 1 in 4, which is incredibly sad, but not surprising. And having done this work for almost 2 decades now, do you feel like we are moving in a direction of healing some of these things and having less addiction, or are we more impacted by, substances and misuse disorders as time goes on? I mean, I know post COVID, the research tells us that, people are struggling at alarming rates, specifically with mental health. But I think one could probably extrapolate from that. They're also struggling with a myriad of other things, and substance use would be among them.
Absolutely. In the work that I've done, I have seen that substance use disorder is not going away. It is increasing for sure. Mental health issues are increasing. The post COVID, you know, politics, elections, wars, all of these societal things are happening right now that
Right.
are really heavy, and we can't control it, right? It's something that is just happening. For the most part, we really don't have a hand in that. And we also see a significant increase in mental health disorders, I think, largely because we don't have enough care as well. Access to therapy can be difficult for a lot of folks, giving the time, the money, their insurance and what it covers. So I think that's a big piece of it too, is people are really not sure where to go with it. I definitely see a huge increase in use as well. Because in some way it's accepted to go home and have some drinks because you're stressed. That's something, that a lot of people do. And of course there are people who can do that who don't have substance use disorder, but it's definitely increasing in being acceptable way to deal with things sometimes, even though we know
Right.
that's really not.
Well, and aside from that, I mean, the healthy use versus misuse is there's a broad chasm there. Really recognizing, to your point, that this is not going away. I think there's also another element to this when you move outside of alcohol into other substances. you know, Help us understand the differences for the adults listening. I mean, we may not recognize the differences in drugs today versus from our generation. They are so much more potent and powerful and highly, highly addictive. Like, what are the things that if you're talking to a parent, they need to understand first and foremost about recognizing what their youth may be dealing with is nothing like what they may have faced in their own addiction journey earlier in life?
Absolutely. And there's an author named Ben Court who wrote a really great book about the cannabis and marijuana changes that we've seen and the potency of what people maybe used in the 60s is it's times like 100 now and that's just cannabis.
Right.
It's because it's so engineered now, and they've diluted it down to like nothing, and it's incredibly powerful. It's also one of the things that I talk about a lot is I fully, understand that marijuana is legal and adults can choose to do that. And I'm not here to pass judgment on someone's use. However, the messaging behind a lot of that sometimes is it's for my back pain. It's medical. There's a prescription.
Right.
It's not as harmful as alcohol, and there's a wellness piece to it that I am not a doctor. I don't know. I'm sure there are some medical uses for it. However, a lot of people go get a prescription and the doctor's not saying how much to use or
Right.
when and how. So there's definitely a lot of messaging around it that I think is not helpful for kids and parents to be kind of discussing it in a truthful way. So I think that's
Right.
important.
Well, and we've made it so accessible. But the other thing is not only is the potency that much greater, but the delivery methods are so much more accessible. If you can use it in a vape pen, I mean, we're seeing youth that are using a vape pen with incredibly potent levels of THC all day long. So it's
Mhm.
not like I just went to my car at lunch and got high. It's like I'm doing it in class, I'm doing it after school, before school, and I'm assuming that level of use really does have some significant negative consequence beyond just impairment.
Absolutely. There are um, cannabis-induced psychosis is a very real thing that has happened. There's a organization called One Chance to Grow Up that does a lot of research around this, and I learned from them just about how this new potency of cannabis is addictive. That's another misunderstanding that cannabis isn't addictive. But people do have post acute withdrawal from marijuana, and um, it's yeah, there's a huge piece of how it affects our brain. And I talk to kids a lot about it that cannabis affects our brain by making dopamine or serotonin, but truthfully, what it's also doing is stopping our brain from being able to do that. So, feeling happy, feeling those feelings without the drug becomes a lot harder. Um, and it does affect people's decision making skills, and it affects our ability to drive a car or to do all these things that people are doing high. And so it's this idea that it's not as harmful is really interesting to me. Like, yes, it's much harder to fully overdose and die, but it's still definitely going to excuse me, it's still going to affect how we do things, and it's still not safe to be using all day long. And that's the thing, is we don't have enough research yet to know how that's affecting us long term, because it's not been legal for long enough.
Right.
But
You teed that up beautifully. I mean, one of the gifts of legalizing marijuana is going to be the research that will support the dangers of that youth potentially will come and is coming.
mm,
And what we are learning, again, this is not marijuana from the 60s and 70s. I mean, this is a completely different animal. And, I would love for you to talk about, how do you see the marijuana use becoming a gateway to other drugs? I mean, I know we have a significant fentanyl crisis here. I've talked with several other people who work in the substance use industry, specifically around kids, and like marijuana is not the only thing you guys are dealing with. I mean, kids are addicted to a lot of different things today.
well, there's definitely the opioid crisis is also a thing that is still very much so going on. That marijuana is definitely much, much stronger than it was back in the day. However, sometimes it's still not enough for kids. Excuse me. I'm gonna take a drink of water really quick.
Sure.
That helps me losing my voice a little bit. Okay. But the opioid crisis is very much also still something that is going on. And for those that are utilizing marijuana that find that, with long-term use, you have to use more and more to get that same feeling. And
Right.
because they build, you can build a tolerance very much so. So when that happens, what can also happen is like, well, I need something more, I need something heavier. And, Oxycontin, Xanax, all those, prescription pills and things can are also somewhat accessible often. I think we're working on that, but it's a different feeling. So they might turn to that to get that high that they're no longer able to get from marijuana. And all those drugs are pretty. Again, it's a safe drug because a doctor prescribed it. But if we're overusing it, then it's not. And does a doctor need to prescribe that all the time? Probably not. So really, again, I think there's some lack of education for kids and understanding that, this is a lot more serious than maybe they think, because it seems safe, because maybe they got it from a doctor, but then maybe they're getting it from someone else when their doctor doesn't prescribe that anymore, or they're stealing it from somebody, and
Or
that
their doctor didn't prescribe it at all in the first place to them.
exactly. Yes, absolutely. Definitely they're just using it for that recreational piece. but wherever they're getting it from, may or may not be a safe place. And that's where that's where these overdoses are happening, is because people are lacing things with fentanyl, and there's way more fentanyl in it than they think, which leads to, those accidental overdoses that are so sad.
Well, I mean, it's just it's tragic that we hear about these things and that they actually have to happen. The fact that we're even having to have this conversation is challenging to begin with. I guess if I'm a parent that's listening and you've given us such great information here, and I think that my teen may be struggling with something, whether it's mental health and or substance use, or I don't really know, what do I do first?
I think first you have a conversation with them, an honest conversation. I also believe that these conversations should be being had when kids are quite young. That would be ideal. But if not, also sitting them down and just saying, I've seen a few things. I'm concerned. I love you very much, and you're not going to get in trouble for what you share with me. I just want to know what's happening for you. I noticed this. Are you using drugs? Are you drinking alcohol? Are you doing these things, and how often? And tell me about that. Tell me what, I think asking them how often, maybe why they feel the need to use it. What's it like for you when you do it? Because their answer might give you a lot of insight into what's going on. And obviously, these kids aren't going to sit down and have this conversation with you, but I do think that's the first try, is just to sit with them and listen, and not react too much. Just listen and hear what they have to say, and that they're going to feel better about sharing if you're not flying it off the handle with
Right.
looking forward.
Regardless of what the answer is.
Absolutely. Like, just stop and listen and see what they need. If that doesn't happen, maybe there is some next steps. If you're not able to sit down and talk and kind of find out what's going on, I can very much so imagine kids sitting down and being like, I'm not, nothing, everything's fine. Which then maybe it might be better to get some professional help, someone who can guide you through this process a little bit more.
So if I'm really hearing you though, I mean, there's two things that came out of that. One, it really sounds like as a parent, trust your gut.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also what gets tricky about that is if you have your own substance use issues, like, recognizing that your kid may be more challenging. But I think as humans, we have a pretty great guiding resource in our gut instinct. And if something seems off, it probably is. But you
Mhm.
mentioned earlier, like having these conversations early with your child, like how early are you suggesting parents start having these conversations, even if it's just to create awareness around these things are out there and you should know that there are pitfalls, and you know here's a safe way for us to communicate by something that you may face at some point. When do you start those conversations?
Honestly, we start those conversations in my organization at 6. Um, Granted, these are kids who are maybe more impacted
Okay.
with seeing that substance use. But I think as young as 6 is an easy time to start talking. Maybe not fully about all the different drugs and those things, but it's a great time to start talking about, if you were ever struggling, if you're feeling sad, if you're having these feelings, I hope you can talk to me. And just talking about how to talk about feelings, having those hard conversations, I think is something that kids can practice quite early, with knowing who's their safe person, where are they going to go when they do have a problem or see something. And it could be something like, alcohol. I know lots of parents early on, if they do drink alcohol, and maybe it's not a disorder or an addiction, alcohol is for people 21 and over, and it's not something for anyone under that. And you know people can have a problem with it, but some people don't. I
Right.
talk to kids about it. Same thing with marijuana. It's for adults, it's not for kids. If you ever have questions about it, or you see a friend who has questions, please let me know, because this is something that we talk about in our home, is these types of things. I think it's more, maybe less about the specific drugs or alcohol and more just about we have a relationship where we can talk about hard things. You can come to me if you're worried and you won't get in trouble
Right.
necessarily
Right.
for sharing these types of things. So just opening that line of communication, I think, is the first step with being able to have harder and harder conversations as kids get older.
I love that, and I think that's so valuable, and you're spot on, and just being able to have open and honest dialogue is kind of the foundation for really anything, whether you're facing something already or you're going to face something or you never do. I mean, it builds that rapport and level of trust that kind of can mend so many fences as time goes along. We talked a minute about, and I know that you guys are focused on mental health and substance use. Let's talk about the mental health piece of this because, statistically, you often don't get mental health without the substance use and vice versa. Like, help us understand a little bit more about the prevalence and the direct correlation between the two that can sometimes drive some of these substance use misuse disorders.
Absolutely. Mental health is a huge piece of substance use disorder. I often think of it to kind of talk about it simply is that uh, mental health is really what we're treating. Substance use is a symptom of mental health. It's a way people are trying to medicate or self-soothe. It's a way that they're using something in order to not deal with the mental health that things that they're probably struggling with.
Right.
And not that it's always a full-on diagnosis. There's definitely a lot of statistics out there that show the the correlation between a diagnosable mental health issue and substance use disorder. But it could also be very much so just like trauma that maybe hasn't fully manifested in some sort of diagnosable uh, mental health disorder. However, what we see is that we really are treating that. I talk about it with kids that when people are going to treatment, they're learning how to deal with their feelings and problems and secrets. They're learning how to gain coping skills in order to deal with the hard things in life that it's not turning to using alcohol and drugs and or any other, you know, um, uh, coping skill that's maybe not as healthy. So um, it's definitely a really big part. The other thing that's really interesting to see in families is that sometimes the substance use disorder is the primary thing we have to treat, obviously, because it's a life or death issue.
Right.
However, when someone starts to maybe get sober, it's not that the person is 100% better. They think often, well, they stopped using alcohol and drugs, so everything's fine now. But that's usually not quite the case because that's often when depression, anxiety, other personality disorders are still there, and we need to focus on that because it's not going to be all sunshine and roses just because someone gets
Right.
stops the use because they are dealing with hard things and they need to work through that. So that's really how we talk about recovery is continuing to work on ways that you can have a coping mechanism that's healthy and that works for you and that doesn't hurt others and noticing that mental health piece is hard, I think, because sometimes people think they just are using these alcohol and drugs and they don't care and they get addicted that their body needs it, but it's really, it's not necessarily a choice in that there are choices they can make, but once that addiction is turned on, it's really hard to turn off. And they're also struggling with other things. It's really, like I said before, a symptom.
Well, and if I'm hearing you, it really feels like mental health is a front and center component in your recovery program. I
Mhm.
mean, really recognizing, and in fairness, I wonder if we wouldn't have the fits and starts that we have if we weren't actually talking about it as mental health and really as learning healthier coping strategies to get through life. I mean, one can argue that that all has a direct correlation to mental health, but at the end of the day, really the foundation of any of these programs is focused on and around how do you have a healthier walk in life. How do you have healthier skills, coping mechanisms to get through without having to turn to some of these alternatives that can lead to addiction in some very dark places. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's how we talk to kids about their recovery. And obviously they're not struggling with drugs and alcohol, but they can learn and start practicing some of these skills. We talk about self-care, that there's, 5 parts of self-care, our bodies, our minds, our spirit, our feelings, and then that part of us that needs to just have fun. And we need to have balance with those because really, addiction is one way that someone might cope with these things, but we all
Right.
know there's a lot of other dark paths someone could
Of course.
walk, right? Or go into. And just because maybe you don't have substance use disorder doesn't mean you're a healthy person. And, obviously nobody's perfect, right? But
Right.
we all have our issues. We all have our things that we need to work on and deal with. And yeah, learning how to cope in ways that are good for us. But it's hard. It's hard work. It's hard to face these things or to do that self-reflection on how can I change this to be better? How can I work on this and face maybe some of those darker things or admit that
Right.
we've maybe hurt others. And I think everyone can benefit from, you know, I wish everyone could like take 3 weeks and go to a mental health facility or rehab or, whatever that they can go and like really do that self-reflection. Like that's such a gift to be able to do. But we really don't prioritize a lot of times our own mental health or our own well-being because sometimes it feels easier just to ignore it, even though it's not going to make it go away.
Right. And I think really for so many of us is just delaying the inevitable. Like at some point, you're going to get to do this work or you're not, and it can result in some pretty catastrophic outcomes. But, the thing that I'm fascinated with about your program specifically is when you work with youth, you also have a very dialed in family component to it. Talk to us about the importance of really looking at recovery or approaching recovery from a family unit versus just, oh, my youth is addicted to whatever. And, that's their problem. Like you guys have really broadened the model to include the family and kind of the tentacles that can be involved in that, correct?
Absolutely. But as kind of like we've been saying, this is a family disease. A person doesn't just get addiction and that's their problem and they have to get better from it. The entire family needs or deserves, I should say, that help and that support because we also know that when someone is getting sober and getting into recovery, their likelihood of staying that way goes way up if their family is involved.
Okay.
And that's they have support, the whole family is learning different ways to communicate. So in our program, we really try to talk to parents and kids and give them all the same language. We do a lot of family communication exercises where they can talk and they all have to do their own work. We talk about that all the time that the person who is struggling with substance use disorder is often that's the person who's trying to change things in their family. Um, they're the ones who are trying to get better, but the other family members who are really stuck in their own way are harder to get into any sort of treatment or program to try and help them cope with what's been going on in their own stuff because well I don't have addiction so nothing's wrong with me is often kind of
Or I
the
do have
narrative.
addiction and I'm not dealing with it and don't want to.
Exactly. So the whole family has to change. We kind of think of it, like uh, cogs, giant cogs that are turning, and if one starts turning the other way, the other ones need to as well in order to stay together. And so it's just so important that family members get education support and looking at their own well-being because modeling is also a huge thing. I talk about that with parents all the time. If you're telling your kid one thing but doing the other, your kids only see what you're doing. They don't always hear it because
Mm,
why would I believe you if you're telling me, oh, we need to talk about feelings and take care of ourselves, but then you're not doing that
right.
yourself, your kids are going to watch your behavior more than your words. So
Well, it's the old do as I say, not as I do scenario.
mhm,
And we know that that does not build rapport.
right?
It does not build trust and often can, really lead to, just acerbated, symptoms of what's really going on. Like in your work of doing this family structured work, how often does dealing with a youth lead to a parent recognizing their own challenges and seeking recovery on their own? Is it pretty common or not really?
Yeah, I work with a lot of parents who are in recovery and their kid is now going through addiction. But
Right.
I definitely have seen it the other way around too. We sometimes do our prevention groups in in elementary schools. And we had a little girl in that group talk about her mom and her mom struggling. And, but we gave her, we were, working with the little girl, but we don't work with the parents in the school group because it's just a prevention group for that school.
Right.
However, the little girl went home and talked about what she'd learned. And then I got a call from mom, and I was a little bit nervous at first, like, oh,
What did she say?
what's she gonna say? But she was like, but it made me realize that maybe I do have a problem, and can you help me get into treatment? And so I was like, gave her a bunch of treatment resources, and she started to get her own help because she heard from her kiddo that, mom, this is a problem. You're
Mm.
struggling. And so really one family member getting help, even if it's the youngest one, can help change the whole family. And I loved that story because I just think it's so powerful that parents, when they do hear it from their kids, I think it's such a powerful experience of like, okay, I need to make some changes here.
Well, there's significant power in the young voice too. I mean, from a younger, more youthful perspective of hearing something about, an adult and what they're doing in their lives. I mean, that really is something that for many of us should make you stop and take pause around. I need to pay attention. Like my actions are affecting other people. And if my young person is recognizing this and talking about it, perhaps there's something that isn't working here. And again, I love your approach of this is not about shaming anybody, but I think it's so important for us to underscore that, the generational piece of this that, you know, doesn't normally just begin with one person. There's often a history of many people that have struggled with this. There's also a lot of power in healing if people are doing their own work.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's the thing I also want to really touch on is that there's hope. There's a lot of hope for change. I
Right.
see families changing every day. Sometimes families don't come along and it's just maybe it is one person on their own trying to get help and get into recovery, but there are people that care and support and want to be there even if their family maybe isn't ready to make that change on their own. There's the opposite of addiction is connection.
Right.
Is something we always hear, and I really think that's true, and everyone deserves to have their own community of people who are healing and working towards getting better as opposed to staying stuck in their trauma or disease or whatever it is that they're struggling with. That there are a lot of people who can and do get better. In Colorado, we have a wonderful treatment community here, but there's a lot of different resources and people really want to help others get better. So I think that's always an important piece that even though things feel like they're getting worse, and maybe they are, and as a society, there are options for people to heal and change regardless of what's going on in their family.
I love that. And I want to get back to resources in just a second. But
Mhm.
before we go there, I mean, I know that there are a lot of kids from blended families, divorced families, etc. How different is this family approach in the co-parenting world of, you maybe have mom and dad don't really enjoy each other's companies anymore, but we've got this real issue that we're trying to face with our kids. How do you navigate that and help parents overcome the bigger picture is supporting your kid and putting your personalities and feelings aside, is paramount for doing this work.
It's tough. That's a very tough situation. And it's very sad. I deal with that's one of the things I work with the most is co-parenting, and co-parenting maybe with someone who's active in addiction or co-parenting with someone that you really don't like. And so a huge, ideally if they're in my care, I can sit them down and have them, I really try to help them prioritize what's important. You know, you two don't have to be best friends, but like this is hurting your child the way you interact with each other. It is hurting your children. It's hurting you too, really helping them prioritize like this. You both do care about your kid. You both want your kid to be okay. You don't agree with how things go, but can we come up with a plan? You are still family,
Right.
whether you like it or not, you are still family. So I think helping them understand the impact it's having on their children, also helping them understand, ways that they can communicate and deal with things in a way that doesn't mean they have to always agree. But when we have an agreed upon parenting plan, agreed upon discipline strategy, things like that. It can really help them take the emotion out of it because we're all just sticking to this one thing. And sometimes it is working through some of that emotion, can be helpful. But I also, if it's appropriate, involve the kids. Like, why don't you tell your parents what this has been like? If that feels appropriate for that family. And I do think when they hear it, they're like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that.
So really, it's a conversation around level heads need to prevail.
Yep,
And we have to
absolutely.
come together for a common goal.
Yep, absolutely. And many are able to do that. And those that aren't, we do talk about if you're parenting with someone active, like how can you make your home a safe place and then protect your kids with safety plans when they are with the other parent. If that person was really uncooperative and not willing to do any of that work, doesn't mean that these kids are doomed and this family is doomed. There are still things that we can do to help these families, and it's not this hopeless situation, but
right.
that is a reality that we face as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm taking away from this conversation again is hope, but there is much work to be done, and I am so inspired by the work that you're doing and the gift that you bring to the world, Lindsey. You had mentioned resources a little bit earlier. If somebody is facing this in their home or recognizes that they may need some additional support, where do you send people first? I mean, I know obviously the work that you guys are doing at Hazelden Betty Ford is an excellent resource. Are there other places to begin if somebody's not ready for that step that they can go to and get some information to rely on?
Absolutely. I mean, I think individual therapy is always a great place to start if you're just not sure and you need some support and you want an outside, someone who's not a part of your family, doesn't have that bias. There are groups. There are, Al-Anon and AA. There are other support groups out there if you kind of just want to talk to someone who's going through something similar. We work with a lot of kinship groups.
Right.
There are interventionists are a great resource. We talked about our friend Amy Moore earlier. She interventionists have tools. They have resources. They can often talk you through a little bit about next steps if it's a loved one you have that is struggling. If you are struggling, there's lots of things you can do too. We do have tons of we have a whole continuum of treatment at Hazelden Betty Ford. We work with families, family members. We work obviously with people with addiction, teenagers with addiction. We support the kids who are impacted by a loved one's addiction. So there we have a whole continuum of resources there. There are websites to check out. I know SAMHSA and NACOA are great ones that talk about the family side of things. And then SAMHSA has a lot more of that mental health kind of stuff. There's books, there's podcasts, there's things online.
Right.
So many things. I think that first step is just finding someone you trust who you can talk to about things, because they might be able to help you say, like, maybe we need to take one more step. Maybe we need to do this next, or let's try this. But there's so much out there.
Well, and also Nobody's Perfect podcast was the precursor to Nobody's Perfect Community, which is a hub of resources from self-empowerment through crisis resources and everything along the way. So if you're listening, I encourage you to look at nobodiesperfect.community to get more resources, in addition to the things, many of the ones that Lindsey's listed here today, you can find there. Lindsey, as a final question before we wrap up, tell me, what does the phrase nobody's perfect mean to you?
I really enjoy that phrase because it's so true. Especially working in addictions and substance use disorders, seeing people come in with so much shame and guilt about, I'm a bad parent, I'm a bad person. But truthfully, what a unifying statement that nobody's perfect. Nobody is. We
and it really implies everybody, honestly.
Absolutely. Like, we all have things going on. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone does things they wish they could do better. It's not about being perfect. It's all about how do we recover? How do we do things differently? How do we learn from our mistakes? So we're never gonna be perfect. It's a bar you cannot reach. But I appreciate that. It kind of puts us all, you have addiction, but this person, has this issue and this trauma, and we all, have these things so we can find that commonness in each other, I think is such a huge piece towards really making the world a better place. Is just taking a minute to understand that we're all struggling with something,
Right.
and we all deserve that compassion and healing, and seeing that in each other, I think, can really help.
That's beautiful. And as I always say, everyone struggles. Lindsey, I want to thank you for your time here today. It was really great to get some boots on the ground insight from the work that you're doing to help youth and families that are struggling with mental health and substance abuse. So thank you for that. And thank you for being part of the Nobody's Perfect community dedicated to supporting, inspiring, and empowering youth and families. We hope you enjoyed today's transformative conversation. And together, we're dismantling stigma and providing solutions for mental health and well-being challenges so everyone can thrive. Join us every other week on cozy101.com/imperfect or on your favorite streaming platform to continue embracing our shared human experience. And feel free to subscribe and follow us at Nobody's Perfect Community on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and TikTok. I'm your host, Jason Hopcus. It's been a pleasure having you here today. Stay connected, stay inspired, and remember, nobody's perfect because perfection isn't real. Your story is. Until next time.